Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here in sunny Barcelona. I spend much of my life going to conferences to talk about very earnest, rather dull topics like central banking. So coming to talk about fragrance is absolutely wonderful. It's one of the few things that my kids will think is truly cool. So thank you. I am going to be talking, as you just heard, about the question of truth in the world today. I'm not going to try and talk about science. That's not my speciality, but I'm going to talk about truth and information and the media, because as you've just heard, my day job is that I oversee the Financial Times in America. I was actually trained as a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology. So I've spent much of my life thinking about information, cultural patterns, how people map out the world in their head. And I can tell you as a journalist, the last year has perhaps been one of the most challenging of my career, my entire career. And I've worked in the Soviet Union, I've worked in Japan, I've worked in Europe. But working in the Trumpian America is something quite extraordinary. And people sometimes say, well, is that because he keeps attacking the media? Is that because he keeps being very nasty to you journalists? And in some ways, that's part of the issue. But in fact, the direct attacks is not the biggest D that we're actually coping with, not the biggest problem we face. The bigger problems are the fact that Trump doesn't just directly attack journalists, he distracts us by constantly tweeting out news that essentially take up all of our headspace and stop us from looking at the underlying issue. I tell my journalists that when we see a tweet at midnight, you have to treat it like an Agatha Christie novel and ask, okay, so where's the body buried? What is he trying to hide with this particular tweet? What is he trying to distract people from? He destabilizes the media, another D. Essentially, by pumping out these tweets constantly, he keeps people on the back foot. He disintermediates the media. He's essentially talking directly to the voters rather than going through media channels. And last but not least, and this really is going to be the key theme I'll talk about now, he discredits the media. He has discredited the concept of there being a truth. He has discredited the idea that journalists are trying to tell the story as fairly as they can. He has discredited the idea that there is one single overarching narrative which people can, if not agree on, then at least try to uncover. So it's not just direct attacks, it's destabilization, it's disintermediation, it's distraction, and discrediting. And it's been very powerful, partly because Trump himself has not generated this new climate. He has simply ridden the wave. And what I want to argue is that in the last few years, some very, very fundamental things have happened across the Western world about how we regard information, how we regard society, how we conduct politics that matter enormously. And I don't think they've had nearly enough attention. And so I want to try and describe a bit of what's going on today, because it not only affects the world that I live in as a journalist, it also affects, I would argue, the political scene, and it probably affects the way that you are operating in your own consumer world. And the key thing I want to talk about is the impact of technology, and above all else, the impact of this. Our humble smartphones, our cell phones, our laptops, and all the digital connections which have come to completely overwhelm our world and reshape our world. And it's something we don't spend enough time thinking about, because as someone who's trained as a cultural anthropologist, I can tell you, quite apart from the question of the media, what this, our smartphone, has done to our concept of information and the way we map our society is really quite profound in terms of the cultural patterns that are shaping our lives. And if I want to describe these cultural patterns, if I want to describe the kind of mood of Western societies and Western politics, I use a shorthand, which I hope doesn't cause you offense, but I use 4 letters, which I think sum up the key themes. And these 4 letters are these: F-U-C-U. F-U-C-U. I think it captures the way that voters, consumers, Trump consumers, if you like, media consumers, are looking at the world today. So, what are these letters? Well, the first letter is F. F stands for fragmented. And it points to a theme that I think is one of the greatest ironies of the modern world, that people simply are not talking about enough. And that's the problem, that we think we live in a world today which is fantastically interconnected and, if you like, joined up as a single world because of technology. These devices give us the power to talk to anyone in the world. We essentially are connected through systems in a very, very profound way. So much so that one of the biggest problems for our modern planet is the issue of contagion. If you dial back a century or two ago, if you had a pandemic in one corner of the world, if you had a flu virus in one corner of the world, it took some time to spread across the globe. If you had a revolution in one corner of the world, not everybody would know. If you had a market crisis in one corner, again, it would take a while before that spread across the globe, if it spread at all. Today, because of our digital connections, because we live in a tightly interconnected world in an economic sense, through supply chains, through all the markets, what happens in one corner of the world can flash across the entire globe at lightning speed. I mean, you know this if you're working in the fragrance industry, in the consumer industry, because fashions now move around the world very, very fast indeed. So we have the illusion that we are hyper-connected. And yet, the reality is that when we go from our real lives into cyberspace, we don't drop all the tribalisms that have been shaping mankind for millennia. The fact we always like to cling to people we know, the fact we tend to talk to people who seem like us, the fact that we tend to trust information that comes from sources that appear familiar. We don't drop that tribalism when we go online. On the contrary, when we go online, increasingly we tend to intensify our tribalism. Because what these devices give us is choice. We can choose to connect with everybody, or we can simply choose to connect with people who are just like us. And we can do that more freely than we could in the past, when we just lived in real life, tangible life. And so as a result, if you look at studies that computer scientists have done of how people are using social media, how they're using Twitter, what you're seeing is a pattern where people are becoming more and more polarized. If you like, the internet has sold us a bill of goods. I remember talking to Biz Stone, the founder of Twitter, a few years ago, who told me that when he dreamt up Twitter with some friends out in Austin at the South by Southwest conference a few years ago, they imagined Twitter as being a bit like a cyber pub, a bar. I mean, they actually had the vision of Twitter because they were trying to meet their friends at some Tex-Mex margarita joint in Austin, and they realized that if they use this short little messaging platform they developed, originally, in fact, for emergency services, if they use this messaging platform to try and tell everyone where to meet, they created an impact like a flock of birds. Essentially, they sent out a message, and everybody flocked together as a single pack. If you ever wondered why you had that little blue bird, why Twitter actually has its name, it comes out of that image of flocking online. And so their vision was that the internet, Twitter, would get people to flock. And that happened in the first couple of years, when the number of people using Twitter was quite small. But when the number of people using Twitter grew, it began to fragment into these separate tribes. And so a device that was intended to cause people to flock together caused them to fly apart. And so when you look at how that's combined with information, when you look at how people are actually using social media platforms to find their news, what you find is this very polarized picture. There's been some surveys done by a group called Edelman, public relations company, which shows that in America, 53% of people don't listen to people they don't agree with. American consumers are 4 times as likely to ignore information they don't agree with. 70% of American consumers only get their information from one news source, from one political spectrum. Actually, I'm surprised it's as low as 70% living in America. And 2/3 of Americans say that last year in the election, they did not have a good friend who took a different point of view politically. I think that would probably be a very similar pattern in the UK today in relation to Brexit. It probably would be very similar in much of continental Europe as well. And I wouldn't even dare to comment on how that plays out in Barcelona today with the Catalan question. So you have a world of fragmentation, the F. And that is very, very important to recognize up front, because much of the time that fragmentation is concealed because we think we're hyper-connected. Second letter to think about, U. And that stands for untrusting and unbowed. Might sound a bit strange, because we don't think very much about trust as a concept normally. Or rather, we didn't think about trust very much until the 2007 financial crisis. Because thinking about the kind of question of trust seemed to be the sort of thing that anthropologists worried about, but people who were economists or policymakers or had MBAs didn't need to think about too much. But these days, the question of trust, the question of what we do trust and what we don't trust, has become incredibly important. And the reason is that if you look at almost any survey of the population in the Western world, what you can see is that there's been a very sharp decline of trust in almost every major institution over the last decade or two, particularly marked since 2007. And it started with a sharp falling off in trust in banks. No surprise there because of the financial crisis. It was followed by a sharp decline in the level of trust in business, then a decline of trust in government, and then most recently, a quite sharp fall in trust in the media as well. We journalists are now pretty much on a par with politicians in terms of what the Western voters trust, or rather don't trust. So trust has been falling. The level of untrust, distrust, has been rising. But to my mind, what's actually more interesting to look at, rather than just asking about the levels of trust, or rather distrust, is to ask, what do people still trust in? Are there things that they do still trust, even at a time when the level of untrust, distrust is rising? And if you dig into the data, and there's a very good survey by Edelman which looks at this, a very, very interesting pattern emerges. One interesting theme is that there's one sector of business which has retained high levels of trust, even as people have lost faith in banks, in auto companies, in pharma companies, etc. And I don't know if you know, any of you know which sector of business has retained trust? Very slight dip last year, but still sky-high levels of trust, over 85%. And banks are 30%. No. Amazingly enough, it's the technology companies. I find it quite extraordinary. But basically, their trust has remained high all the way through. The second thing, which is very, very striking about the surveys, is that if you ask people who they do trust, where they look for trusted information, what you see is a pattern where if you dial back a couple of decades, people would look up to see where they wanted to get their trusted information. They'd look up to CEOs, up to governments, up to experts, even sometimes up to journalists. Today, they don't look up, they look sideways to their peer group. Trust has moved from being something on a vertical axis to a horizontal axis. Very, very important shift. And to understand this, I'll give you some numbers. Trust in government today, according to the Edelman survey in the Western world, is currently 29%. Trust in corporate boards is 35%. Trust in CEOs is 37%. Sorry, any of you who are CEOs. But trust in employees is 52%. People trust an employee as a source of information more than the CEO. And trust in a category called a person like me, i.e. my peer group, is 60%. And if you combine that with the sky-high levels of trust in the tech sector, which frankly I find amazing, but is still there, what people are basically saying increasingly is, you know what, I don't trust this government anymore. I don't trust the politicians. I certainly don't trust the CEOs or the bankers. But I kind of trust my Facebook friends. I trust the people who are in my Twitter tribe. I trust the people I connect with on social media. And if you stop and think about that for a moment, that kind of reflects how you are increasingly living your lives. I mean, if you're going on holiday these days, you know, do you go off and ask a travel agent for advice? Remember those? You know, or do you click online and look at TripAdvisor or Expedia and check out the group ratings? If you're going to a restaurant, do you go to Zagat's? Or do you actually ask all your friends, anyone know a good restaurant in Barcelona? Increasingly, we are looking towards our horizontal group for trust rather than upwards. And in some ways, that is absolutely fantastic. Because if you stop and think about it, a world where we're trusting our horizontal peers rather than authority figures is actually a world that's very empowering. You know, we have a right to have our opinion heard, and we're just as good as those politicians. It's a world that actually is much more egalitarian, if you think about it. But there is a crucial catch. And the catch is this. A world where people are increasingly trusting their peer group online, coupled with a world of fragmentation and tribalism, is a world where essentially you're creating these separate little echo chambers and separate little groups who are getting information and news sources from each other, believing each other, defining the truth according to each other, but not necessarily overlapping. This is a recipe for a world where you can actually have alternative truths. Or as Edelman says, it's a post-truthy world. It's a world of alternative facts, to cite Kellyanne Conway, the Trump spokesman. It's a world where you can have different tribes in the same society absolutely convinced that they are correct, but actually they're not talking to each other. And if you want to understand the impact of this, I'll give you a couple of vignettes of what we're dealing with as journalists. 2 weeks ago, as you may know, Robert Mueller, the former FBI director who's now overseeing the Trump inquiry, came out with the first set of indictments. Probably most of you were aware of this. Who out of the group here lives in America? Okay. How many of you read Breitbart? Okay. Okay, one person. Yes, well, good. Because most people who fly around the world for a living, or who do a journalism job, or do international business of any sort, tend to be the kind of people who read things like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, that kind of group. And so the top story for that group 2 weeks ago was the Mueller inquiry and the fact that Mueller has already indicted 3 of Trump's key campaign team and still has another 3 sealed indictments for people we don't yet know about, which will be revealed at some point in the future. So, big story. If you were, however, only watching Fox TV and only reading Breitbart, which is a website created by Steve Bannon, in fact, you would think the top story in America that week was the fact that there is a raging argument about the hamburger emoji put out by Google. And I am not kidding, okay? There are those of you, anyone here know about the hamburger emoji scandal? Okay, 2 or 3 of you, okay? Right, well, basically, as you know, the issue at stake is do you put the cheeseburger in the emoji image at the bottom or the top? But I kid not, that was the top story. So you had half of America obsessed about whether Trump is going to be essentially impeached, and the other half worried about whether the hamburger emoji should put the cheese on top or down below. That is a world of alternative facts, alternative tribes. Or, if you want a more immediate example, I flew over last night from America, and I picked up USA Today, which probably none of you have seen. If I'd had time, I would have actually tried to put this up on a slide, but I'm happy to show any of you who've not seen this so I can pass it round. And this is a picture of one of the ads placed on Facebook on October the 19th, 2016 by Russian link groups, okay? And this was essentially using the Facebook technology to find out who would be interested and open to this kind of image. Essentially, they were targeting religious evangelicals to essentially send them messages about Trump, to support Trump. And it's a picture of Jesus and Satan arm wrestling, okay? So have that in your mind. And it says at the bottom, press like, i.e. the like button, to help Jesus win. At the top, it says, Satan, if I win, Clinton wins, exclamation mark. Jesus, not if I can help it. And the catchline says, today Americans are able to elect a president with godly moral principles, i.e. Donald Trump. Hillary is a Satan, and her crimes and lies have proved just how evil she is. And even though Donald Trump isn't a saint by any means, understatement, he's at least an honest man, and he cares deeply for this country. My vote goes for him, press like. This was an advert that was pumped out, we don't know to how many people, because in fact most people never saw that because of the Facebook technology. But it was an advert that I bet resonated with a group of people. And for one of the tribes who were probably sharing this on Facebook, this was something that seemed like the truth or a fact. A world of alternative facts. And an even more immediate example is what happened, the terrible, tragic shooting that happened in Texas a few days ago. A few minutes after the shooting news came out, tragically, some conspiracy theories began to, it says on this, spread misinformation that essentially took the Facebook page he had posted of a picture of a gun with various obscenities and claimed that he was linked to Antifa. This is a group of people who are essentially anti-fascist and have been battling with the neo-Nazis in America. And this spread like wildfire amongst people who don't like Antifa. A world of alternative facts. So that's F and that's U. C, check how I'm doing with time. Right. C stands for another theme that you probably don't think about much, which is customization. Customization. It may be something you think about in the consumer world because customization has increasingly become a trend that shapes anyone who's trying to deal with consumers. But I argue it's got a lot of implications for politics too. Because as an anthropologist, if you look back at how Western society has developed in the last few centuries, there's kind of been 3 interesting shifts. If you dial back a couple of centuries ago, or 3 centuries ago, essentially the vision of mankind, the map that people had of how society worked, tended to assume that humans fitted into society, not the other way around. The idea that most cultures in the world have of humankind is that essentially people are taught to imagine themselves as being a small cog that fits into a bigger machine. You know, you are defined by being a member of a social group. You don't really have a sense of identity other than being part of the fabric of that group. And then particularly the second half of the 20th century, we began to move into a different vision of society and a different definition of personhood, where essentially people began to increasingly think that they were the center of their own world, and society was almost a subset or derivative of them. the rise of the me generation, if you like. You know, the me generation is a concept that's quite well defined now. But what's happened in the last decade or two is something much more important and subtle, which is that increasingly people have been trained to not only think that they are the center of the world, you know, me, you know, the sun revolves around the moon, not around the earth, not the earth around the sun. But increasingly technology, this humble device, has given us the presumption that we have a God-given right to fashion the world around our needs and desires. The idea of customization, that we can customize our surroundings in whatever way we want, has become quite deeply ingrained in the way that we raise our children, the way we live, the way we imagine the world around us. And if you don't quite see what I mean by this, just think for a moment about music. When you were growing up, most of you probably assumed that if you wanted to listen to music, you either just switched on the radio and listened to whatever they were offering. Maybe you could choose a couple of channels, but you basically had no choice about it. Or you went to a store and you bought an album. Remember that? Old-fashioned albums. Somebody else had chosen your music for you. I mean, you could choose what particular rock band you wanted to listen to, but if you bought ABBA, you basically got the greatest hits and it was pre-chosen. Kids today regard that as just hopelessly prehistoric. If you're going to listen to radio, you choose your radio station, and in fact, you might actually choose a podcast instead. If you're going to choose your music playlist, you choose it yourself. If you're going to go to a restaurant, increasingly people assume they can choose their food. You can choose your clothes. You can choose your friends. You can choose your information sources. Going back to my first point, that actually the world of cyberspace has intensified tribalism. The reason for that is that we can choose our identities. We think that we are increasingly in control of not just ourselves, but the world around us. It's not just the me generation, it's the me shaping the world as I want it to be generation. And that matters for consumer industries enormously, as probably most of you know. I mean, as a journalist, we spend a lot of time now thinking about how we're going to serve up the news to people, because the idea of an editor just telling people, these are the top 10 stories you're going to read today, that just doesn't work anymore. People want to say, I want these stories. This is my newspaper, my website, defined according to me. But it also matters for politics, because if you stop and think about it for a minute, if we live in a world where we can customize our music playlists, our food, our clothes, our friends, our identities, why does anyone think that we're going to sit there quietly and accept preset political parties? In many ways, it's a very old-fashioned idea that anybody would sign up to a preset political platform. You know, we are the pick-and-mix world. People are increasingly wanting pick-and-mix politics. And if you look as an anthropologist at what's happened in the last 5 years, what you're seeing is sometimes described as the rise of populism. And in fact, if you look at the issue of populism in terms of voting patterns, you can define what's happening in that way. Ray Dalio, the head of a hedge fund called Bridgewater, recently went back and tried to calculate the share of the vote that had gone to populist parties in the Western world over the last 100 years. And what it shows is that from about 1910 to about 1930, the share was around about 20%, and then it shot up dramatically in the 1930s to about, at one point, I think from memory, about 50%. Then post-World War II, it went back down again to 5-10%. And then, of course, in the last 5 years, it's shot up dramatically, interestingly enough, back to the same level as the 1930s. So you can describe what's going on as populism. But another way to look at it is that this is basically the rise of pick-and-mix politics. What's happening is that voters are saying, well, I'm not really sure whether I'm Democrat or Republican or Conservative or Labour, but there's one or two issues I really care about, and I'm going to get very angry and vote on the basis of that, and I kind of ignore the rest of it. Or there's a particular person I really like, a celebrity that I really like, and I'm going to rally to them, and that's going to be my defining pick and mix politics thing this year. Brexit, Catalan independence, Trump. All of these people are essentially not so much populists, but pick and mix politicians. Is Trump a Democrat or Republican? He doesn't know. Half the voters don't know. Macron, which party does he belong to? Well, he didn't even have a party until a year ago or 6 months ago. He literally created his own party. That is the ultimate pick and mix politics for a politician. Most voters on Brexit, they came from the right and the left. If you look at who's been voting for Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, that is astonishing in the UK, because people outside the UK might think that the people backing Jeremy Corbyn were all a bunch of hippie students. Wrong, wrong, wrong. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn won a majority of votes amongst the professional employed people in their 20s and 30s. Pick and mix politics. A lot of people voted for Jeremy Corbyn because they couldn't stand Theresa May, and they somehow thought that Jeremy Corbyn was going to be pro-European. Pick and mix politics. And as you look at that pick and mix politics, if there's one unifying theme that the people who are successfully selling pick and mix politics are selling right now, it's really a message of change, a general sense of motion and empowerment. Coming back to the issue of customization. I was very struck because I went last year to both the Democrat and Republican conventions, and the Democrat convention was a bit of a disaster, not just because it was so pious and so muddled in many ways, but they had two slogans. First big mistake, don't ever try and sell yourself with two slogans because it confuses the consumer. But the slogans were dreadful. One slogan was, I'm with her, which sounds like a boy band. The other was stronger together, which is kind of cute, but very static. Trump had make America great again. One simple slogan, and it has a verb. It's about empowerment and motion. Brexit. The Remainers campaigned on stronger in. Again, pretty cute, I happen to agree, but it's also pretty static. The Brexit camp campaigned on take back control. A verb, motion, empowerment. Make America great again, take back control. Two crucial elements. Theresa May this year didn't learn the lesson. She campaigned on strong and stable. She might as well have said, I'm the status quo. Guess what? It wasn't very popular. Macron, when he created his pick and mix own personal political party, name the party? En Marche. Those of you who are French speakers know. Motion, movement. We're moving. So in a world of pick and mix politics, customization, empowerment, people want that sense of motion. A verb is perhaps the most powerful thing that you can sell these days at the politician, maybe even in the consumer industries good as well. And once again, in some ways, pick and mix politics is quite empowering. It gives a sense of people matter. But if you come back again to these letters, F-U-C, add together fragmentation, add together unbowed, untrusting, add together customization, what you end up with is a recipe for what I call cyber flash mobs. We're creating a world where politics is essentially pretty, fourth letter, unstable. A world where people, voters, get very passionate about themes at certain moments. They rally around key causes and issues, Brexit, Catalan independence, Trump, and then suddenly all the energy explodes and then dies down again. It's a world where essentially politics is being disrupted. It's a very unpredictable world, unstable world. very uncertain world. And it's a world where information keeps swirling around along these tribal groups, these fragmented groups, these echo chambers, and yet does not enable people to have a serious grown-up debate about the key issues that are facing the Western world today. So it's potentially a very unstable, uncertain world too. FUCU. I personally don't see much sign that those trends are going to reverse anytime soon. I'd like to think they would, but I don't see it. I don't see any sign that our addiction to these is going to go down. If any of all of you who've got teenage kids will know that if anything, the next generation are going to grow up with these actually biologically implanted on their hands. You know, they won't put them in their bags. They're actually going to be literally attached to them. So in terms of finding answers to this, I don't have any very clear ones. But we need to start talking about this FUCU world. We need to start thinking about what this is doing to us. Because it doesn't just affect business. It doesn't just affect the way we're educating kids. It doesn't just affect the media. It affects politics too. And I just hope that the next generation, the next smartphone-obsessed generation, will find a better way of dealing with the consequences than we have so far. So, thank you very much indeed for listening. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to talk about anything you'd like at this point other than science. Post-truth, I'm good at, so thank you.